Summer Brenner is the author of a dozen works of poetry and prose, including crime fiction, collections of short stories, and award-winning young adult novels. Nearly Nowhere is available from PM Press. Dante has been a popular commentator for over a decade and has only recently revealed her writings at Philadelphia's erotic literary salon, NoirCon, Noir Riot, and IOTA Arlington. Stephen Jay Schwartz is a Los Angeles Times best-selling author. His novels Boulevard and Beat follow the journey of sex-addicted LAPD detective Hayden Glass. So now please welcome Summer. Thank you.
Good evening. How does that sound back there? No reverberation? I want to thank the Contemporary Jewish Museum and Litquake. It's an honor to be here. We're also pleased to be here. And thank you, of course, to PM Press and Ken Wishnia, who's the editor of the Jewish Noir Anthology, for including us, inviting us to participate. Before I get started, and we're a little bit on a time track, so I'm going to actually really try to be aware of that, I want to mention another of the anthologies that PM published that you might want to look at when you go over to the table, called Sid My Love and a Molotov Cocktail. I think the title speaks for itself. And also, two of my crime books are for sale, as well as some of my youth fiction. And the two books are I-5, which is about sex trafficking, and Nearly Nowhere. I want to mention that I've read Steve Schwartz's amazing novel, Boulevard. It's very gripping, and so I recommend that you look that up too. I also want to take a chance to mention Everyone Has Their Reasons by Joseph Matthews that PM published and that they're also selling. I hope the Jewish Museum will think of, the Contemporary Jewish Museum will think about inviting Joseph for a reading. It's about a historical figure named Herschel Greenspan who murdered a Nazi consul member in Paris in the late 30s. Maybe you've heard of Herschel Greenspan. He's a little bit lost to history, but the Nazis attributed Kristallnacht to that assassination. And instead of being tried and actually executed himself, he lived on, languished for several years in jail. And this is a real literary feat, this book that recreates Herschel Greenspan's life. So I'm going to begin by talking just a little bit about Jewish Noir itself and what Kenneth Wishnia has done in the introduction is create a very erudite reason that Jews should be very connected to the whole history, genealogy of noir itself. And he quotes a lot from the Bible. He references a lot of Bible stories. In brief, I'll just say that those of us who know anything about the Old Testament know that the figures of the Old Testament are flawed men. You only have to think of the crimes of Isaac or David or Moses. So the heroes of the Old Testament and of Judaism itself are really flawed and complicated people. We don't have a perfect idol. We have flawed men to inspire us. So I think that in itself speaks to the genealogy of noir. My story is called Devil for a Witch. I want to just mention the title or discuss it briefly. The Southern expression, you trade a devil for a witch. You think about that. We've all had a problem. We've all wanted to solve it. And that problem was the devil or devilish or something that we wanted to shake. But when we came up with a solution and we actually went to that solution, we might have found out that it was just as bad or worse. And that's what Devil for a Witch is all about. It's the context of the story is the anti-Semitism of the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi in the 1960s. although I attended a temple in Atlanta that was bombed in the late 1950s by a member of the Klan. So growing up in the South and not so much experiencing directly the anti-Semitism that was on the playground, which makes some of the most terrific stories in this book, by the way, but having your temple bombed and going to services the next day where there's this gaping hole in the sanctuary, you know, having to walk through police lines to actually get into the synagogue, that was that left a very, very deep impression. The story doesn't start out sounding like that's exactly the direction it's going to be going, and I'm going to read just a brief section. So the epigraph, two of them. The first one is by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it's from a poem he wrote called The Litany of Atlanta. Whither? North is greed, and south is blood. Within the coward, and without the liar. Whither? And the second epigraph from al-Mutanabi, a 10th century Arab poet who would have lived in Baghdad some of his life. If you see the teeth of the lion, do not think that the lion is smiling at you. The funeral for Leon Greenberg was graveside and the service short. As little as possible was said about the deceased, nothing personal or elegiac. His death blotted out any cause for celebration of his life. If his existence had once been charmed, it was not mentioned. Star chemist, decorated Navy officer, brilliant raconteur, and once holding the enviable title of husband to a beautiful rich woman, no such attributions were uttered. Suicide was a willful negation of life. Out of confusion, sadness, spite, its legatees accepted that the dead man's last act overrode all others. Across town at the reception, limos dropped the mourners at the Steiner split-level Wonder, a glass and steel extravaganza around the corner from the governor's mansion. It was Atlanta's most prestigious address, even if the governor was a murderous bigot. In the Steiners' living room, Shiva was under heated discussion. "He's an atheist!" Irene Greenberg shouted. "Was," Philip Steiner said. Was. I'm his wife. I know what he wants." "Wanted," Phil amended. "He does not want Shiva," she insisted. "When my father died, we sat Shiva because he wanted it. We sat 2 nights until you went off to a golf tournament." "He wasn't my father." Irene shook her fist like an impotent human before the throne of God. "He gave you everything." "Stop it," he croaked, holding her wrist and tightening his grip. "My husband just killed himself. I'm permitted to completely lose my mind." "I'm sitting Shiva," Marilyn Steiner, Irene's sister, said. "Leon doesn't want it, but now that he's dead, he's helpless. He's in the clutches of Zionists." "Helpless," Phil snorted. "Not with you as defensive end." "I loved Leon," Marilyn sighed. "Well, everyone knows about that," Irene said. "Shut up," Phil ordered. "Your husband wants me to tear my blouse because he knows I bought it on sale at Rich's. I don't wear Vera scarves and Charles Jourdan shoes like my sister. I can't afford to shop in New York." Irene twisted the end of Marilyn's scarf, shortening the loop like a noose. "Would you tear your precious scarf if Phil died?" "Get a sedative." "Phil Steiner is a usurer," Irene shouted. Usurer. Murmurs of sympathy followed as a phalanx of black maids lifted Irene off the ground and carried her to another wing of the house where Valium was forced under her uvula, her mouth clamped shut and her neck stroked like a dog. Well, that was only after she broke Sarah Weiner's cane over Phil's arm, when Sarah's hands were occupied with lox and deviled eggs. The cane splintered and caught Phil's shirt, ripping it open, scratching his chest. A tiny chest. that's funny, a tiny scratch. But Phil agonized if Irene had bitten his heart out, which she would have if she had had the strength. Later, when the pill wore off and she was at home in bed, the recollection of the cane, its percussive thwack, Phil's expression, the blood, his torn shirt, and the chaos and confusion that ensued were deeply satisfying. Irene laughed about it for years. So that's a very short section of my story, and I thought if we have a moment more, I'd read just a page or two from a couple of other stories, so you'd get a little bit of a sense of the breadth and depth of the book. So I'll read just a little bit of Good Morning Jerusalem, 1948, by Michael J. Cooper, who lives in Berkeley. How's our time, Gravity? Do I have a couple of more minutes? Okay. So this is called Good Morning Jerusalem, 1948. I never slept well under mortar fire. Last night was no exception. The flares hadn't helped either, night shining like day. But once the brandy clubbed me, I finally got some sleep until the brandy wore off and the mortars woke me up. Lying on my cot, I open an eye and see that the light splashed on the whitewashed wall of my improvised office and bedroom is no flare. Dawn is broken, and with it increased fire. In addition to the thud of 3-inch mortars, I hear the clatter of Sten guns, ours and theirs, in and around the old city of Jerusalem. I give up trying to sleep and sit on the edge of my cot. My temporary quarters is one of 28 small shotgun units with Yemi Moshe, a single-story housing block on the western slope of the Hinnon Valley. We face the walled city, about a quarter mile away. The place was built by a rich British-Italian Jew, Moshe Montefiore, about 100 years ago to serve the poor Jews of Jerusalem. It still does, but not now, not with the fighting over the past year. They moved further into West Jerusalem, and we moved in. We're the Palmach, the elite strike force of the Jewish militia, the Haganah, and Yemi Moshe, with thick limestone walls and its proximity to the old city, serves us well. The Golem of Jericho by Jonathan Santlofer. I remember it all, everything that occurred during those first few months of Long Island living in the biblically and ironically named town of Jericho, a mid-island development built on the site of a former potato field, flat and devoid of character, still a few years away from malls, multiplexes, and Jews. I was 10 when my parents moved us out of an apartment in the city into a split-level home, the post-war dream, theirs, not mine. Maybe 100 or so houses, cheek to jowl, on streets named for famous admirals, Dewey, Nimitz, Lay, Halsey, all worthy seafaring men, I'm sure, though I had no idea who they were at the time. Our split level was on Seaman Road, one more thing to be teased about, though I had no idea why until much later. I knew so little then. But I know what happened, what I brought on, something unimaginable and unspeakable, which I'm about to tell you, actually admitted for the first time, and I hope you will understand that I didn't mean for it to happen. Thank you. I think I'll turn it over to my colleagues, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Summer. Thank you for that wonderful little introduction that you gave, too. Summer and I have been admiring each other's work for a couple years now, ever since I was introduced to her book, I-5, which is just phenomenal, beautiful work. So that's something you ought to pick up for sure. I feel really fortunate to have a short story in Jewish Noir. Ken Wishny had asked me to do something for Jewish Noir, and I said, yes, I definitely want to do it, and I procrastinated until he said, Steve, you got to give me something. And I said, well, the only thing I really have is this short story I wrote 30 years ago. It's my very first short story, and it never got published. Or I never sent it out, although it had been in competitions, and it had got blurbs and all these things like that. And he read it, and he said, well, we'll publish this. I said, Thank you. So it's the very first short story I wrote, and I wrote it right after my father died. I was 20 years old. So and my buddy Jim here, who I haven't seen in 30 years, was with me when I wrote this in Santa Cruz, actually. So I'm gonna read just a very, very small portion of it, and then leave some other stuff for the imagination, I guess. Yahrzeit candle. Sure is a big candle, Daddy. It was the biggest candle he'd ever seen. Did you make your wish? He said, excited. Joshua's father stood silent, having used all of his wishes. Reflections from the candle flame danced upon his face. Joshua frowned at the man and turned back to face the candle. It made him feel uncomfortable, a candle left to burn and burn. He'd already seen 8 sets of candles in his lifetime and had succeeded in extinguishing them easily after the wishing ceremony. If only Daddy would let me blow it out, he thought. A sure stream of air would do it. His father's hand was a gentle pressure on his shoulder. No. A soft word hardly spoken. Joshua crouched like an angry gnome. Who needs this stupid candle, he thought. It just sits here like a big dumb firecracker without the guts to explode. I don't like the candle, Daddy. Why is it here? His lower lip had a chipmunk's quiver. He wiped a drippy nose across his arm. The man brought out a handkerchief to wipe Joshua's face, then lifted the boy to his knee. I want you to look at the candle, Joshua. Josh leaned into his father's chest and did as he was told. The light was too bright in his eyes, and he turned away. His father gently pushed his head back to face the candle. Little Joshua Fader stared into the flame and realized he hadn't seen his Frisbee in years. He had meant to ask his father if he wanted to play soccer, but somehow Frisbee got stuck in his mind. Look into the flame, Josh, and don't be afraid to let the smoke get in your eyes. Joshua saw the little trail of smoke that drifted up from the flame. It had the shape of a frizzled ribbon on a birthday present. The flame was an opaque lemon gumdrop. Its center was almost white and seemed flat, two-dimensional, like a thin piece of wax paper tearing through an ebony canvas. It stood prominently and demanded his attention. Joshua couldn't shake the feeling that the flame was watching him as much as he was watching it. Its stare was the stronger one, and Joshua was the first to try to break it, but it wouldn't let him. He felt dizzy. The blood was rushing fast, and he heard his pulse echo in his temples. His eyes grew tired as smoke drew scribbles around his pupils. His memory brought visions of his grandfather. They were in a house that was vaguely familiar. There were ghost shapes all around, people that Josh should have known. They talked and laughed, and some of them reached out to pinch his cheeks, baby cheeks. Then they'd fall back into the crowd, laughing, talking. They jiggled rapidly with their laughter. No, it wasn't the people that jiggled. It was Joshua. He was riding a small pony or a knee. His pudgy fingers reached into the polyester slacks that hid the knee. Joshua laughed and gurgled and drooled saliva across his flabby cheek. He followed the knee with his eyes, laughing at everything connected to it. An old leather belt, big plastic buttons on a plaid shirt, hairs beginning to gray on a stodgy neck. Then his grandfather's face, all smiles. The face was kind and saying words to Joshua in baby talk. His eyes were deep and large. A baby could crawl through those eyes. Josh saw a flickering light deep inside them. Except for the light, the eyes were dark and deep, and little Joshua crawled into them. He crawled until the others were far behind, and there was darkness all around. As he continued toward the light, his arms and legs grew, his torso enlarged, and his face began to change. He soon found that he was walking, and then he was running. Joshua ran with incredible speed until he fell. He pulled himself up and saw that the flickering light in his grandfather's eyes was a candle and a flame. Joshua's body heaved and his eyes began to tear. He turned quickly and smothered his face in his father's chest. I'm sorry, honey, I'm sorry. His father's words were barely spoken. Tonight, he whispered, Daddy's going to sleep. So I'm cutting into a little future here. At 10 o'clock on Saturday night, Joshua rolled out of bed. He wore his fuzzy purple pajamas with the plastic feet. They were his favorite for nighttime deeds because his footsies hid the sound of his footsteps. He crept along the hallway cautiously. Candlelight made the shadows a giant spider web that tried to hold him back. It felt like he was walking through the shallow end of a swimming pool. As he cleared the end of the hallway, he could see his father's sleeping figure beside the candle. He slipped gracefully past the man and drew up close to the flame. No sooner had he peeked over the table edge than the candlelight scattered fearfully into its shadow. The flame stood alone, nervous, seeming to know the boy's mission. Joshua addressed the quivering teardrop. "You're something very strange. You shouldn't have come here." The flame stood still. "I'm sorry, but I have to do this." Joshua licked his thumb and forefinger and reached out to the glowing wick. The flame belched smoke, and Joshua withdrew his hand to protect his eyes. The smoke blurred his vision. He was looking over a deck of cards on the back porch of his old home in Indiana. "Three of a kind beats two pairs," Grandfather announced with an honest grin. "You told me you didn't have any eights," Josh yelled. The old man laughed. "It's poker, not go fish." Joshua picked caramel from his teeth with a jack of diamonds. "It's 5-card draw," the man continued, but he could sense his companion was bored. His spotted white hand jostled the boy's hair. "Come on," he said. "Grab your Frisbee and we'll go to the park." The memory faded and Joshua screamed. He pounded his fist on the living room table. "Zadie!" he yelled. He felt his father's hands around his chest, holding him tight. Joshua cried hard, pounding his forearms into his father's side. The doctor's hands, his father's hands, massaged the boy's back, neck, and head. Everywhere his hands touched, the pain went away. His father kneeled and kissed his son's wet cheek. His tears fell and mingled with the tears of his son. Saturday night at 10 o'clock, they huddled as one, father and son, while the candle watched from above. Joshua awoke in the early morning sun and found himself on his sleeping father's lap. The man hunched forward, taking deep breaths as if his lungs were filtering oxygen through candle smoke. He appeared peaceful, save for the dark semicircles inverted beneath his eyes. The Sandman had sealed them tight, Josh thought. Josh tiptoed up to what was left of the candle, a thin sheet of liquid wax with a blue pencil dot flame. A trail of smoke rose steadily like a stroke of dark ink from its belly. Joshua saw the flame shrink into itself, coughing one last puff of smoke before disappearing for good. The never-ending trail detached from the wick and rose from a waxed, lifeless body. Joshua stepped away from the table. Some of the candle smoke drifted toward his father and vanished into his nostrils. A moment later, his father woke with a startling, dusty sneeze. His bloodshot eyes revealed a sad, dim light. He chewed the inside of his lip unconsciously, slowly orienting himself. His gaze passed through Joshua and onto the candle, which was already forming into a pool of hardening wax. For the first time in 7 days, Joshua saw his father relax. The blood in his eyes drained away, restoring color to his cheeks. He stood with uncertain balance, gently rubbing the tender spot above his temples. He glanced at the candle and walked away. Joshua ran to his side and took his hand. He led the weary man to his bed and helped him undress. The clothes were stiff and smelled of sweat. Joshua tucked his father under the covers and kissed his forehead. The man was already asleep. The vision of his sleeping father returned to a blur and then back to a simple memory. Joshua Fader rubbed his tender eyes. His spine was a steel cable. Muscles leached to every bone. His head throbbed and his heart raced. He sensed the delicate footsteps of his father behind him. Daddy will make the pain go away, he thought. Joshua felt the gentle touch on his elbow. He turned quickly, his arms reaching out, but stood there, clasping nothing but memories. A small voice rang from the child at his feet. "Are we going to play soccer or what?" Joshua sat down and lifted his son to his lap. He pulled the boy close to his heart and held him tight. "Not now, David, in a few days." He turned around in his chair and faced the yahrzeit candle. "Look here, I've got something to show you." Little David Fader stared into the flame and realized that he hadn't seen his soccer ball in years. That's that. Thank you very much. And now, M. Dante.
I met Ken Wishnia at Lou Boxer's NoirCon in Philadelphia. And after we started talking at the awards ceremony, it turned out that we had a lot of mutual connections in New York going back over 20 years. And he was like, "Well, you have got to submit a story to this anthology I'm working on." And basically, it was already closed, so I had a very limited amount of time, and I did not want to recycle anything. So I wrote this story about my father's funeral, specifically for the anthology, and I'm really glad that it was accepted, because I think my dad, despite how, well, it makes us a little bit vulnerable in its candid, sharing of our lives, but I think he would approve. This is called Blessed is the True Judge, Baruch Dayan Emet. The call came in while I was at a luxury apartment in Atlanta. I was there as a call girl, a comfortable and lucrative 2-week opportunity I had wanted to visit for more than 5 years. It took patient, hard work, always with a smile, plus a spoon of sugar to get the referral, but I was in. And then on the second day, the call came in. My father was dead. His body shipped from Las Vegas to Boston. I was expected to meet the casket at the funeral home back in the area where I was born. I called the anonymous woman who ran the Black Book apartment, letting her know I had to go. Her voice was soft and kind in a Southern sort of etiquette way. She confirmed, though, if I left early, I'd not be able to return for future work. Tears flooded my senses, though I kept my composure. It was one of those moments in life for which there is no coaching, no practice, no preparation like you have with your best friend before a date or practice rounds before public speaking. Stay and miss my dad's funeral, leave, and potentially never have another job at this price point again. I shook my head and sighed in frustration. At the funeral home, there were roses, dozens of them, a decadent extravagance ordered from Las Vegas. My dad was Jewish. The funeral home was Jewish. Jews get pebbles, not roses. The funeral director was kind enough to display them without comment other than a polite nod and quiet sentiment of acceptance. The roses were from my dad's life companion, a man 20 years his junior with whom he had lived for a decade. Love Sinclair was on each and every card. In the casket, beneath the roses, lay my dad. Instead of the ritual tahara, he had to be embalmed to fly back across country. The first and only person in Lebanon Tifereth to be embalmed. Jews are supposed to simply be buried within a few days, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, except for my dad, eternally preserved with glamorous perfection. His hair blonde instead of light silver, his suit stylish, except that he had stopped wearing suits when he moved from Boston to the Southwest 20 years prior, trading the business attire in for jeans and brightly colored button-down shirts, all the colors of the sunset. There he was, though, embalmed, wearing an elegant yet traditional dark suit and a masculine tie, lying beneath the multiple bouquets of love. I have a photograph of me standing beside the casket. Sinclair, unable to be there with us, requested we ask permission to photograph the final process. The funeral director sighed, his expression pleasantly placid from practice, his eyes expressing displeasure as he acquiesced to our request. So there is an actual album of photographs. One of them, me in my ill-fitting Ann Taylor dress jacket and a brim hat, standing over my golden-haired embalmed dad with roses all on his casket, my expression bizarrely perplexed with sadness and the surreal quality of the situation. This is my dad's death. No goodbye. It was silent, spontaneous, and strange. In the business office, the funeral director sat on the opposite side of the desk from my dad's sister, her husband, and me. My dad had no burial insurance, no prepay on the process. The plot, purchased by older family all since gone, was paid in full, though the cost of the funeral itself was due without delay. I looked at the invoice, thinking I should have stayed at the brothel in Atlanta, my aunt gently accepting the bill as I started to pull out my credit card, saying she would cover the cost of the funeral for her big brother. Her husband nodding his head in agreement, embarrassment sat equal with appreciation. The conservative cemetery appeared bleak, at least to me. Utilitarian is a polite way to describe it. No ornaments, no decorations, a stark place of almost unsettling silence. Situated off the side of a now busy highway, it is difficult to see the wrought iron gate unless you know it's there. The turnoff from the main road, dangerous even. Off in the distance down the way was a mall. Retail therapy being one of my dad's few vices, it seemed appropriate despite the grounds lacking any lush ambiance. There were less than a dozen people present, some levaya, though in all fairness, my dad had moved away a long time ago, leaving behind his life with his family, coming out of the closet as a homosexual, able to go from whisters of eccentricity to living his truth every day. Besides 2 employees from a family company closed 25 years earlier, I was surprised to see his first man friend present, not his life companion, who at that very moment would prove to be lying in a stupor of OxyContin sported after pawning all the gold jewelry my dad left behind, but his first public romance, Ed. I pondered for a moment the humor in how, when my parents first divorced, they both had affairs with men named Ed. Instead of laughter in my ears, the quiet consoled me in a way that only during death it can do. That silence soothing, carrying a collage of fragmented memories. I remembered back to when I was 10 or 11, how my mother's boyfriend sat me down in the kitchen of our new apartment while my mother was out, telling me gruffly that my father was a faggot and that my mother was with him now because he was a man, including being man enough to tell me, which absolutely no one else was. Years later, he was arrested as a pedophile. I was grateful for my hat, keeping the haze and clouded sunlight out of my eyes. I didn't have to see how empty it was there. I didn't like the idea of my dad being lonely for all of eternity. After a turbulent life, I wanted him to be at peace. I wondered if the glowing moon rock I buried with my grandpa was still doing its job of lighting the eternal night with the light of safekeeping. Like a piece of sea glass collected when young, by day it represented the ocean we were raised near, and at night the moon in the sky. Amidst the Hebrew of the service, in the breeze, an image of Lilith appeared hiding behind a tree, distracting me. Lilith living in one of the trees on the periphery of the grounds, an owl and 7 ravens, emptiness, wide open emptiness. Panic played with my senses, but then I realized he would be with the family that most loved and accepted him. No Dybbuk could break through the veil of love here. The women who all doted over him, raising him while the men were away at war. The great-grandparents and the grandparents he remembered as active people as opposed to fading photographs and nursing home odors. His mother, who died at the same age as him, really just shy of 60. All that love buried deep down in the dirt, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. A part of me felt there with them. My bubby, my Zeta, the great-grandparents, my grandma, my grandpa, my nana, the aunts and the uncles, all of those who traveled the oceans here from far, far away, ashes to ashes. All those embalming chemicals in with the dust left from the last exhale of life. Someone captured the moment. In the album I have of Dad's funeral, there is a photograph of me standing awkwardly, attempting to keep my heels from sinking any further into the soil. My posture curved in a strange sort of serpentine bend, brushing my hair back off my shoulders, looking into the space where he would lie, neat and tidy, surrounded by family, eternally cleansed, coiffed, and well-dressed. A perfect state of narcissism for the eternal rest. This suddenly seemed so fitting, except, of course, for the roses. The service was over. The funeral director came and pinned a torn piece of ribbon on my jacket. Kariah. Another photograph capturing the moment. My suit jacket and wide-brim hat felt too large for my frame. I wanted to rip off all my clothes, shred them, pin the torn ribbon directly into my skin. Instead, I stood stoic, ripped ribbon scratching me in the wind. I had left him a message. Good luck tomorrow. Don't forget, Dad, a good attitude is half of the ability to heal. I said about his appointment to have his heart checked the very next day. Don't forget, I love you. But he was already dead. During the preliminary blood test, his heart literally exploded in the hospital. The casket made its descent while I was lost in thought. Time doesn't always move in a straight line. I was given a fistful of dirt to throw down onto the casket. Kavura, mix it with tears and may it become a golem. My dad called home early by a heart tired and slightly broken. He was ready to rest in the bosom of idyllic yesterdays, remembered in ritual visits by the shells and small stones from the shore left on each of the family headstones. At his sister's house, situated by the ocean near where I was born, everyone was politely pleasant, though it was awkward. "What were you doing in Georgia?" each person asked, the polite questions burning each time over. I felt dirty. No chemical process could clean the stain I felt spreading through my spirit. The torn piece of ribbon was scratching at my throat. An aging whore, daughter of a queer. And again, I saw Lilith out of the corner of my eye. I saw her fly by in the wind, and then a seagull in the distance welling into the breeze, the echo distracting, diverting attention. And I wondered if seagulls are ever distracted by the glare of the sun on the sea glass or by the moon reflecting off the waves of the ocean, constantly in motion. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for that. Would all the authors like to now just take the stage, and we can let the audience ask you questions about your work or about the anthology?
Hi. Thank you for the lovely stories. I guess I'm interested to know what you think noir is and how your stories fit into that genre, why you chose these stories and how you see it fitting into that, because the selection of stories was diverse and not exactly conventional. That's the first question I have. I have others.
Okay. For me, noir kind of seemed natural because I was writing, I generally write crime novels that are considered noir, and I kind of thought that Yahrzeit Candle would not fit into that category. But Ken read it and said, no, this would fit into noir, Jewish noir. I said, okay, that sounds great. And you know, after reading his introduction, he's got a really great introduction in the book just about, you know, kind of how Jews kind of fit so easily into this noir. I tend to agree with him. Now my understanding of noir has definitely widened. And I think, you know, it's right what Summer said before, is that it's the characters are generally failed type of characters that are not your typical superheroes. They're people that we can identify with. In my own novels, the protagonists of my books are, you know, it's a guy who has an addiction, and he doesn't think he's a good person, and he hates himself in a sense because of that, and yet others around him see him as heroic, and the reader, in a sense, can kind of see that he is a heroic person because he puts others ahead of himself, because he has a bad look at his own self. So with the Yahrzeit Candle, I don't know if there's a character that's like that's faulty, but there is frailty. You know, there's a father who is not paying attention to his son, and a son who is needing attention, and in a sense, the candle brings them together. So I don't know if that, you know, there's death in that, so there's noir, you know, but I don't know exactly else how that fits in.
Is my microphone at a good volume? Okay, so traditional noir, you know, is a story that starts in a bad place and then dramatically spirals down. Just when you think it can't get any worse, it flies even faster in a downward spiral. Neo-noir tends to be just a little bit darker. It's not necessarily the same kind of crime, noir, like pulp or hard-boiled style of yesterday's. Neo-noir could be, say, Breaking Bad or Southern Gothic style, which, you know, Flannery O'Connor's writing would kind of be a starting point with that. But then if you look at all of the kind of witchy vampire type shows that hit cable coming from points down south. That all that has merged. So taking that evolution of noir to neo-noir, the one thing that I've come to realize about being Jewish is we start in a bad place, and we don't necessarily spiral down. We live there. Other people who come and join us might have a bad fall down, but it can be very awkward because things that I've noticed that other Jewish people who have similar views to me, like there are certain things that we think are normal that other people think are very dark. So it's taken me a long time to accept that, and my writing, my fiction and my creative nonfiction really didn't ever fit into a genre until fairly recently, as it's become more socially acceptable to talk about somewhat darker topics. I will say, with this short story, my dad came out as a homosexual in 1980, and with that, when I was 10, I lost my entire community. We were basically like exiled, and my friends at school weren't allowed to speak with me anymore. It was a dramatic and huge thing. We were the very first family in our community to not only have a divorce, but there was adultery and there was homosexuality. And so I've grown up with topics that were totally not okay to talk about. And for me to be able to talk about this and not have it be anything more than maybe poetic and fitting, to be able to talk about the dichotomy between the older conservative views and the realities of what's happening now in American culture as a result of our ability to explore our lives and our states of consciousness. It is, to me, a form of fitting neo-noir, and it's also it's just wonderful to be able to culturally share that and realize that we all have little bits of these things in our lives and our families. And if by writing about it, that can make somebody else not feel as though they're living in a completely dark, cold place, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a question that would and could be answered many different ways. What is noir? And I was recently interviewed and, of course, asked this question of what I thought. And I found myself kind of erupting with an answer that wasn't so literary or wasn't so formal or wasn't even so preconceived. It really had to do with noir being somewhat of a genre of work that wants the reader to be uncomfortable, that wants to assault the reader with some ideas that are not necessarily in their radar or less examined, perhaps, even if they're aware of them. I think for me, and the kind of writing that I've been doing in the two novels that actually there are 3 novels I've written, but 2 have been published that are in that noir category, they're really social critiques. So sort of assaultive, uncomfortable, and a critique where you can actually go into, you can create characters, not necessarily stock characters at all. I mean, it's not a Punch and Judy show, but you can really deal with a kind of a sense of good and evil on an interpersonal level, and then on on a social level as well.
Yeah, you can examine the moral compass of your characters. That's something that I really love about noir and about crime fiction, is that you can ask the kinds of questions that we don't often ask ourselves in our daily lives. And what if that bag of $1 million of cash that you found under the table was yours to take? Would you take it? Would you take it if it meant that someone else had to be hurt in the process? If it's one person, if it's 5 people, what would it take for you to take that money? Little things that just ask a character step a little bit over the line, a little bit over the line before they know it, they're beyond the line. And now they're a bad character. Now they're a dark noir character. that I think is very fun to explore.
Would you say that writing about being Jewish in the South is almost perforce noir?
So I sometimes like to describe myself as from a Southern Jewish Gothic family. You know, a few strikes against me. And another thing that I sometimes say to the amusement of others is that I've been downwardly mobile since I left home. I think that the history of Southern Jews, it's a very interesting history. It's complex. There's a book called The Provincials by Eli Evans that actually examines the Jews in different sections of the South, because you have the Sephardic Jews coming to the coast, particularly Charleston and Savannah, being planters, being slave owners, being the treasurer of the Confederacy, Benjamin. And you have something of that legacy. It's been inflated for purposes that are really exaggerated. But a Charleston Jew, an Atlanta Jew, a Richmond, Virginia Jew, a Raleigh, North Carolina Jew, and a New Orleans Jew, they're all very different. Now, when my mother was growing up, there were house parties where teenage Jews traveled from city to city so that there would be the potential for them to meet and socialize and intermarry, intramarry. Perforce noir. I think that almost any group of people is perforce noir if you really try to sort of scratch below whatever the facades that people erect around their socio-cultural world is. I think that would be my answer to your question. Thank you.
So I appreciate your description of the difference between noir and neo-noir. But when I think about noir, I also think about a certain tone of voice and that certain the themes of corruption and post-war angst and things like that. And there's a certain tone of voice that comes with it. And so I just wondered whether you, in writing in that genre, ever feel that you have to sort of force your voice into it in order to actually, for it to be noir. Do you know what I mean? As if you were putting your writing through a filter in order for it to come out as noir. Do you know what I mean?
For me, no, because the noir community has been the first community to reach out to me and ask me to submit my writing to projects that were happening. And I will thank Lou Boxer and the NoirCon in Philadelphia because my first published piece of poetry was last year in NoirCon's first anthology called Noir Riot. And my poem entitled Frankfurt Avenue, about a real love affair that I had, or we could call it a love affair. It was a sexual, like, it was pure sex. It was, an affair. And it was a very dark affair. It just appeals to people who are working from within the noir community. My writing has been appreciated more by people who are aficionados of the genre more than the public, the general public. And so the fact that I'm starting to have a place to present my work, and maybe I will be able to model it so that the general public will be able to understand it and appreciate it better within a few years would be great. But right now the voice is entirely my own.
Noir comes pretty natural to me. That's my more natural voice. I remember in Boulevard when I first submitted that to my editor, and there were little black comic moments throughout the book, and he always crossed them out, and he just said, "You don't do comedy." He said, "You're dark. You don't do comedy." I go, "Oh, okay." So I kind of learned that that's what I had to do. But it's the voice that speaks most clearly through me, and it's how I examine my life, and it's how I go through my catharsis. That's really how I work through issues of my father's death. My father committed suicide, so it was pretty dark stuff. I really definitely influenced by the things that go in my life. And so this way I can be happy in my normal daily life, you know, really, so that, you know, because I can be really, in fact, when I wrote Boulevard, my wife was like, who are you? Who is this person? How could you even write this? You know, and then she proceeded to make me go darker, you know, because she's like, this is cool, I want it. But it's interesting about noir and crime novels. I mean, I judge competitions for like the crime thriller kind of community, the Edgars and things like that. And you know, we don't often think that in today's time, if Lolita and The Collector and Crime and Punishment were published now, they would be judged in the crime thriller community. They would be genre pieces, but they're classic works of art, right? So what I found in this community is phenomenal work. I've seen a whole range of somewhat, you know, somewhat kind of very genre-like, maybe mediocre work, all the way to brilliant, absolutely fantastic work in this genre. So noir really encompasses a great bandwidth.
I'm going to echo that because I think some of the categorizations are those things are a little bit false, and I actually thought of the Dostoevsky as well. In terms of the voice that I use, because I actually write in a lot of different voices, and I guess I'd be in a mental hospital if I weren't a writer. I mean, I write novels for kids, teens, and I write what's called literary short stories. I certainly try to make everything I write as good as I can make it. But when I began to write the sex trafficking book, a certain voice came to me as to how I wanted to express that particular subject. And the book ends up being a very fast, very raw, very clipped. I mean, there's a certain stylistic thing that happened in that book that doesn't necessarily happen in anything else that I write, except when it comes to other noir things. This thing that I read today, and it's actually from a novel called Devil for a Witch, it has a much more kind of, I would say, literary flavor, even though it becomes a very suspenseful novel. And even though it's included in this anthology, I mean, it gets very, very dark, and it's a very violent piece. It just, the section I happen to read starts off, I hope it was a little bit comical. I think there's room for comedy in noir. I'm sorry. No, I disagree.
I just
and
can't
some
write
of the
it.
stories in the anthology
are
pretty funny. One of them actually, I actually laughed out loud a lot, and you know, that's pretty funny.
It's just getting other people to appreciate our sense of humor, I think, yeah.
That Jewish sense of humor. Well, it's famous.
I think we have time for one more quick question, if anyone has one. Who do you read? Which writers do you read?
Who do we read? I read everybody.
I read a lot. The guys I really like, John Updike, John Steinbeck, Jack Kerouac. I'm a big Beat generation. A lot of Johns, a lot of Jacks, yeah. Big Jack Kerouac fan. I've got a Kerouac quote on my arm, actually. It says, "You'll never be as happy as you are now in your quiltish, innocent, book-devouring boyhood immortal night."
Oh, that's a long quote.
Come on, I love that. So Jim Thompson for the dark noir type stuff. Catherine Ann Porter, Hemingway. I mean, a lot of the classic guys, you know. And then there's a guy named James Brown, actually.
Oh yeah.
You know Jim?
No, but I want
He's
to
so
read
good.
him.
James Brown wrote something called the LA Diaries and This River. One of the best writers around right now. John Fonte, Bukowski, and a lot of good writers I like.
Two noir readers I'll mention just very quickly: a Frenchman, Manchette, and an Englishman, Derek Raymond. They're very, very dark, very fine writers. I'm really more interested in the writing than the stories. So you know, if I read someone that, and I think the writing's kind of pedestrian or sort of, then you know, I just move on.
I used to read a lot. I'm a clinical bibliophile. after I completed my master's degree, I have a very hard time reading fiction now, and I have to admit that the Stieg Larsson trilogy was one of the first things that I had read in a long time that was able to hold my attention, because I tend to skim through pages, and if there's not completely relevant information, I discard the page. It's just the way that my master's degree tweaked my brain. When I was younger, when I was in elementary school, I was a total Stephen King junkie. When other kids were reading See Jane Run, I was reading The Shining. So that was a problem, and that evolved also to Clive Barker's stories. But as far as literature, Henry Miller was one of my favorite writers. I just felt his passion and his use of language and the way that he saw life as a form of poetry to just be consumed and annihilated and regurgitated and then, recontemplated, just captivated me. And then with that, the writing of Anais Nin. One of my favorite writers is kind of an obscure woman who she was British. She passed away in the 60s, named Anna Kavan. Her real name, I believe, is Helen Ferguson. I'd have to look that up right now because it's been a while. But the stories that she wrote were extremely surreal. She was very privately a heroin addict, and she had an extremely esoteric, poetic way of viewing the world around her. Alistair Gray, who is was a Scottish writer, is one of my favorite authors. So I have a very strange interest in literature and poetry, and a lot of the beat writing. Jack Micheline, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and William Burroughs is my absolute favorite of all of the beat writers. Yeah, I cannot express how much I just love listening to him read his short stories and his commentary. So, yeah, that mixed into the modern day Stieg Larsson, and you have me.
Another quick note just on the beats. If you guys are really into the beat writers, Jerry Cimino has joined us today. He's the owner of the Beat Museum in San Francisco.
Yay! I stopped in the other day.
Great stuff. Go to the Beat Museum and you get all those great books.
Thank you for coming to the Contemporary Jewish Museum tonight. Can we give another round of applause to our fabulous authors?